very exciting to be a part of this history. Thank you to the Filecoin team. My name's Antoine, and I used to be a congressional intern, which is where the origins of this project come from. And I've also been a Internet Archive employee.
And I'm Bill Marzak. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Berkeley. I'm also a fellow with Citizen Lab, where I focus mainly on research into surveillance and censorship, and focusing on attributing internet surveillance and censorship to various vendors that are involved in this. So I'm definitely excited to be working on this project with Filecoin. Yeah.
All right. So back when I was a congressional intern, I had available to me the Congressional Research Service reports, which are legislative reports written by the U.S. Library of Congress. And these reports are meant for legislators and their staff so that they can be briefed on topics that they might not be experts in. Just because they're elected to Congress or Parliament doesn't mean that they're knowledgeable in every aspect of legislation. And so around the world, we have these research teams that create reports that inform our legislators. And they're highly valuable reports. And my undergrad thesis was on US reproductive health policy, so I wanted to cite this report, but it wasn't available broadly. There was some closed network, the intranet in Congress, and then there was LexisNexis and FindLaw, but there was no open source option for this, which led Bill and I to create a archive of Congressional Research Service reports. So that's the legislative reports for just the US Congress. However, there are other nations that have similar parliamentary research services, and they cover a wide variety of topics. So we have the US Congressional Research Service on the top left here, covering Bitcoin. We've got the top right, the German Parliament Research Services, giving a briefing on TikTok and its relations in the US, as well as the UK House of Commons library briefing paper on the economic impacts of coronavirus, as well as Indian Parliamentary Library report on reorganizing the states of India. So as you can imagine, if you are a researcher or simply interested in international politics, this could be a good archive or resource for you to access. But of course, it would be nearly impossible for you to check over 170 nations worth of legislative reports. And that's where we come in. So taking a step back and just focusing on US Congressional Research Service reports and how hard it is just to access this one nation's reports, we have WikiLeaks filling the gap here. And these are not classified materials, but due to the sheer difficulty of accessing these reports, WikiLeaks stepped in and made a big hurrah about publishing 6,700 of these reports. There's other civic tech organizations like my favorite Sunlight Foundation. They are located and provided public access to 25,000 reports. Bill and I went ahead and created a similar project and released to the public 34,000 reports. So that's a background on only the US research services. And we're taking a look at the global research services next. But first, a little bit more from Bill.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we think is very important about these reports, both in the U.S. with CRS reports, as well as abroad with the Parliament or Congress of various other countries producing these reports, is at least within these countries, they're sort of generally seen as non-partisan resources. And if you look at the US, for example, you can see groups like everything ranging from conservative groups to libertarian groups, open government groups, demand progress. They're all sort of behind this notion of increasing transparency to these reports, not just for transparency's sake, but because they think that by increasing access to these reports, this will better educate the citizenry about issues before Congress. And I think this is true in the United States as well as countries abroad, and especially true given that all this sort of discourse like, oh, we're living in a post-truth society, truth is all relative. But fortunately, there are still these resources that people can go to, that there is sort of broad agreement across the political spectrum on what is factually true and the results of studies that have been conducted. So I think that, making access to these sorts of reports more broadly available, aggregating across different countries, this is a resource that will not only help citizens become more informed, make better decisions, hold their policymakers to account better, but also, as Antoine, I think we'll talk about in a bit, it enables this sort of research that goes across these different data sets. Because of course, while there might be, broad sort of agreement among the partisans in a country to trust this sort of resource, when you start looking internationally, you could imagine, well, like maybe India's reports and reports from Pakistan are going to have, sort of somewhat conflicting narratives regarding, issues regarding the conflict there. So I think that, being able to combine these across countries, I think is very, very valuable. But I think the main point here is that this is sort of, by working on this, we can sort of, bolster the source of objective truth, and, hopefully reduce the conflict over facts and make the conflict over policy.
So you might be wondering who accessed these reports. And again, we so far have limited experience with just the US branch of collection of these reports. But already we've seen traffic coming in from the Executive Office of the President, the Department of Justice, and then dozens of university law libraries. So initially we thought that it would be primarily politicians and lobbyists that would be accessing these documents, but we've had PhD researchers ask for bulk access, and we've had activists accessing our materials as well as archivists and GovDoc librarians, which are probably the biggest case users. So it's been a really promising experience so far, and it tells us that there's a need here that hasn't been filled. Again, there's over 170 national and multinational research services for us to work on. So the method that we choose to approach this problem is very important, and it's quite key.
Yeah, so just to sort of recap here on the problem that we're trying to solve. So there's no single comprehensive repository for the world's legislative research reports. The free repositories that have been created so far, like Antoine's favorite organization, the Sunlight Foundation, they had a repository, I believe it was OpenCRS, just focused on one specific country, the US. But I think it was in the end of 2015, they ran into a problem, which was that they didn't have any more funding. And eventually the Sunlight Foundation, I believe, shut down recently. So, a lot of effort that goes into these sorts of projects. One of the problems that has been present in the past is that, of course, funding dries up, and then, oh, the website's down, the collection is no longer accessible. And the free resources that are out there are typically either focused on one country or focused on a specific topic, like arms control or something like this. A perhaps bigger problem is that when you have these reports, which of course are not classified, not sensitive, not secret in any way, but if they're practically not accessible to the people at large, and practically only accessible to members of the legislative branch, of course this sort of situation enables, at least in the US, these situations where you have pay to play, where someone says, oh well, hey, friend in Congress, can you access this report and send this report, or can you access these reports and share them with me? And then you sort of get the commoditization of this, where you have lobbyists and other middle people coming in and selling access to this stuff, which it should be publicly accessible. And of course, the problem is that by not having this sort of resource, you're impeding progress towards good governance.
So what's key here is that we're creating a free corpus of the world's legislative reports. And Filecoin is a key partner in this that has enabled us to pursue this project and ensure success in a way that really has never been decentralized or possible previously. So there's some characters of the Filecoin that are going to be very helpful to this project. Number one, the durability. The proofs ensure that the files are stored and duplicated correctly. One thing that's key to us is that the Filecoin provides provenance, which allows for useful audit trails and is helpful to our biggest fans, which are GovDoc librarians and archivists. And then further, the continuity of this project is important to us. As mentioned before, a lot of previous efforts to simply archive the CRS reports have withered, and we want to make sure that this continues. So the Filecoin decentralized storage network that allows anyone in the world to contribute and retrieve legislative reports is key to us. And finally, process matters. More than any branch of government, the legislative branch represents the people. The executive branch tends to be much more biased, and the judicial branch is much more technical and focused. So the legislative reports are the people's reports. They are reports that are most commonly written in common language and most accessible to the general public. We want to make sure that these are in the public's hands. And with Filecoin, we can empower the public to host, to replicate, to preserve, to contribute. So this is an optimal collection. The material is aligned with the Filecoin vision to create a decentralized, efficient, and robust foundation for humanity's information. We just want to ensure that legislative reports from the nations around the world are included in this archive. Finally, we've got the technical aspects of this project. A lot of it is built off of what we've done before for the CRS reports project, but of course, the back end is going to be filled in by Filecoin. Starting off with scraping specific archives, such as the Internet Archive and legislative librarian collections, as well as focused crawlers, we're going to be able to identify PDF documents that are probably legislative reports of one kind or another. We'll be storing them, deduplicating them, and then identifying them. Previously with the CRS project, we have used a tool called bounding boxes, which is taking the typical format of a report. Generally, there might be a logo up at the top left. In the case of the US, it's a picture of the Capitol Dome, then some title formatting, and some expected locations of authors' names, report formats, report IDs, which are number alphanumeric regex that we can identify. So the bounding box, we can create a custom one for every single report, but what we'd really like to do is scale in a way that that enables us to attack different languages. And so we'd like to introduce some NLP to content identification and would happily welcome any advice on that. We have some ideas, but would like to push it to the limit. Then comes the priming phase. A lot of these reports are locked or they have marginalia. We need to clean these up. And then we provide the report that is most akin to the original. So if we can get a report directly from the Library of Congress or the Parliament, whatever country that is, we'll serve that one. But if necessary, we'll serve an akin report found from a third party after we've cleaned it up. And then finally, and most excitingly, we have the distribution, which is going to be backed by Filecoin. We're going to have and maintain a congressional or parliamentary legislative report build folder. And we're going to be encouraging our partners in GovDoc librarians to be replicating it throughout the network. So that's the basis of our project. And we're going to be doing 4 countries worth of legislative reports by the end of this year, and then moving forward with the rest. We are doing this all open source and are eager to take any suggestions that you guys have or that the community finds. We found a lot of inspiration so far throughout the Filecoin community and are looking forward to being one of the key players or a player on the future of the decentralized web. So thanks again for inviting us to be a part of this. Yeah, there's a question about verification. So ideally, we would be able to get the original document from the host itself. So if it's the UK Parliamentary Library, we know what domain that we should be able to find that from. It's a very serious problem, and one of the other things we can do is compare it to other variations of that same report that we've got. Bill is also an expert in forensics and could probably shed some light on how metadata might be of use for that as well.
Yeah, so one of the ways that we've sort of thought about approaching this so far is that, in the ideal case, you'd have a country which releases their, the full volume of their reports on an official government website. Now, of course, in practice, that's not really the way it always works. And there have been, several instances, including one I think was in 2012 in the US, where there was some political pressure, I believe, exerted on the Congressional Research Service to retract or change the conclusions of a report. I think about something about tax cuts or something like that. So, you can't always necessarily rely on the official government resource to have everything which really, you ideally as a researcher or a citizen like to have, including like versions of past reports that may be retracted, visualizing changes and things like this between reports. So ideally, we tackle the verification sort of wouldn't be an issue, but of course in practice it is, because we're trying to collect this data from various websites. But even in cases where there is not full publication of all the documents, in some cases there is metadata available. So I think there was a case in the US, Antoine, correct me if I'm wrong, where there was like a freedom of information request for like just a list of like all the CRS reports. And then so that metadata was released publicly officially. And then, you can sort of at least check to make sure, well, is this like a real report or is it something made up? Now, in terms of, verifying whether things inside the report have been changed by a third party, that gets a bit trickier. And I think, what we're hoping is that there's going to be sort of a relatively small number of cases where we get sort of something that looks like a report that is from a source that does not necessarily look particularly official. And in that case, we might need to do some sort of manual investigation, like checking the metadata, checking additional layers in the PDF, and
Bill, I'm going to interrupt you in just a moment, because we also are going to be needing to rely on the community as well. So one of the things that is interesting that we found in older CRS reports is that they were physically scanned into PDFs and then posted on the public web. And in those cases, things like authors' names or just the style and the formatting of those older documents is going to be key in kind of forensics and identifying false reports. The more content you have, the more capable you are of identifying irregularities. Because if somebody just puts forth one report and says this is valid, it's hard to compare it against others. So the more content we get, the better we'll be at identifying those. But it's a real challenge. And then we have one other question. Which countries or multi-nation research services are we going to start with? And that is the US, the UK, Germany, and South Korea we aim to have done before the start of next year.
Thank you so much.